Thought we were going to count down to the sermon.
Yeah. You just did it.
I'll stand here and dance for a minute. Thanks, actually, for reading that text. That is not one of our easier ones. You got a few names in there. Well, so 2 plus 2 is? 6. All right, somebody said 5 earlier. Who said 6? Okay, you're out. 2 plus 2 is 4. Is 2 plus 2 ever not 4? It's always 4, right? 2 plus 2 is always. Alright, what are they feeding you all down there at snack time? There's something. Those snacks are. I'm going to start going down there instead of coming in here and getting ready for worship. Okay, 2 plus 2 is always 4. Now, if you took a family of 5, add to that the democratic process, how many restaurant choices do you get? 5 or 7? Will you get the same options every time? No. Because that's more like how our faith works. It'd be great if our faith worked like 2 plus 2 was always 4. It'd be great if our faith was straight line like a corn stalk or an oak tree, but it's a little bit more like a watermelon vine. It kind of twists and turns. It has some great fruit at the end whenever you find it, but it is not as easy as 2 plus 2 equals. What is that? I forgot. Oh, here we go. I forgot what order I put these in. We are in a sermon series in September on story, because story is a great way for us to talk about things that are not as easily talked about as 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's a way for us to talk about things that are beyond us, outside of us, bigger than us, and yet also profoundly inside of us. So today's story is on Moses. You're being honored, the technology's being honored.
Tell me how much money you owe.
Dave, if you just want to flip this over, I don't know what's happened. I was kind of spinning over there. Let's do another one. We've seen this. So 2 plus 2 is. We're going to Moses. Moses, if you want to read Moses' story, if you start where it actually did, or maybe a chapter 2 before it actually started in the book of Exodus, and then read yourself all the way through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you will get the Moses story. You're going to get a whole lot of other stuff as well. There's plenty of laws in there that are terribly exciting, but they're in there and they're important. They were very important at that time. So there's all this stuff that's in there, but that's the bulk of it. This is one guess on when Moses lived, 1391 to 1271 BCE. That's approximate. We don't have. They were not nearly as concerned about exact dating back then as we are today. They had a little different worldview on numbers and things like that. So that's our best guess on when he was around. More important, though, is for you to know his story, because I find his story profoundly inspiring for at least me today, and maybe for you as well. His story is much like that watermelon vine. It really takes some twists and turns. So Moses is born a Hebrew slave. Now, he's born a Hebrew slave in part because the Hebrews came to Egypt hundreds of years earlier in response to a famine to find food. And when they arrived, they worked so hard, and God blessed them so much, and they became so numerous that the Egyptians became afraid that there were going to be too many Hebrews, so they enslaved them. Well, God continued to look after them, and they continued to work really hard, so by the time we get hundreds of years into this, and Moses is born, Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, is so worried about the Hebrews becoming too powerful that he says to the Hebrew midwives, when you're delivering a baby, if it looks to be a boy, we need you to kill it. If it looks like a girl, you can let it live. Well, the Hebrew midwives were too afraid of God to do that. So Pharaoh finally had to make it law that all the firstborn men in the Hebrew families would be killed, which would have been Moses. Except Moses' family's parents, living on faith, stepped out on faith, put him in a basket, little baby Moses in a basket on the river, and float him down to where Pharaoh's daughter takes a bath every day. And Moses' sister kind of stands off of a distance to see what's going to happen. And when the sister sees that Pharaoh's daughter has fallen in love with this little baby, she steps up and says, I know someone that could be a wet nurse for Moses. And Pharaoh's daughter says, that'd be great. I'm going to need a wet nurse. And Moses' sister introduces Pharaoh's daughter to Moses' mom, without explaining who she is. And Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house. What a trajectory. We have this crisis moment of Moses' birth. It looks like his life is going to end way before it ever should. And God moves in, God's people move in, and it looks like Moses is going to have that trajectory of faith that we all wish. Bel Air, right? Prince of Bel Air. He is going to be in the lap of luxury, living in Pharaoh's house. You would expect the storybook at this part just to go on, and he's going to be like the second ruler of Egypt. It's going to be amazing. But it doesn't work out that way. Moses, at some point in his life, decides he wants to try and reconnect with these people that he's from. He's been isolated from them in Pharaoh's house. And as he goes back to try and discover who are these Hebrew people, it's also the time in which, again, the Hebrew people have become so strong and such a threat to Egypt that now Pharaoh, who has demanded them to make bricks for him, has decided to remove part of their building material to make it even more difficult for them to meet the quota. And in the midst of that oppression, Moses walks out to see who they are and sees an Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew worker. And he's so incensed by this injustice that Moses kills the Egyptian guard. Now he has to flee. This trajectory of his life that looked so golden as he was a part of Pharaoh's household, now he has to run off to the desert because he's committed murder. God looks after Moses, and Moses marries Jethro's daughter and becomes a shepherd of part of Jethro's flock, and it looks like finally Moses is going to find a way to live in peace and prosperity. He's out there doing well as a shepherd, and flocks are growing. It looks like he's married. Finally, Moses is going to have that wonderful life that we all hope for until he runs into the burning bush that Ashley led to us today. Another twist in his life. Because now God takes Moses and says, yeah, I know things are going great for you right now, and you're doing what you want. You're an 80-year-old that can climb a mountain. How awesome is that? We're going to send you back into the lion's den. You have to go back to Egypt, and you have to tell the Pharaoh, who you know, to set my people free. I will tell you all that story. You may have read it, or I encourage you to. Moses does try to make excuses and get out of it. God gives Moses all the resources he needs. There's these plagues, there's a lot of excitement, but eventually Moses leads his people to freedom. Again, in Moses' life, we have a moment where you think, now Moses is going to have that wonderful life. Now Moses' life is going to have a trajectory of amazing abundance and prosperity. He's just led these people to freedom. He's going to be their hero. They're going to go to the promised land and have this amazing life. So he does. He leads them. Oh, sorry, I missed that. So he leads them to the promised land, this land of milk and honey, abundance, fertile ground for their crops and their herds. And as he leads them right up to the border of the promised land, they send a few spies in to see what's on the other side. And the spies come back with these crazy stories about giants and amazing warriors. And the people that Moses had just led out of slavery into freedom become afraid and run away. Moses has to lead them for 40 years through the wilderness to get back to the promised land a second time. Again, this trajectory that looks so amazing takes a twist, and we have this 40-year journey. And yet Moses sticks with it. That's part of the amazing thing, right? If he's 80 when he climbs the mountain, who knows how old he is by the time he gets to the promised land the first time. And then he's got to take them on this 40-year adventure. Well, along the adventure, we've had this moment in the desert where God's been providing manna, and it looks like, okay, it's going to be a long journey, but they're being taken care of, they're getting manna every day, they're worshiping God every day, things seem to be going well. Moses gets invited up onto the mountain to meet God. The trajectory is looking even better. Again, he gets to see God face to face. It looks like things are going to turn out just the way it should. Moses is up there in God's presence. He's getting the 10 Commandments, the laws on how to live as God's people. And he comes down to find these people have made a golden calf. They've abandoned God, And now God is telling Moses, I'm just going to have to kill a bunch of them. In fact, that tribe from whom you were born, I'm just going to kill all of them because they're so faithless, they're not even worth my time. Now Moses is going to go back up the mountain. He's got to plead to God. He's got to make excuses. He's got to intercede. God changes God's mind. The people survive. A way is made for them to live. Another twist in this whole trajectory. It's just incredible. Well, Moses' life is for us an example, right? I know about your life. My life has not been a straight line of growing faith. It's been a wonderful life, and I'm thankful for it. It's got its twists and it's got its turns. Sometimes I cause the problem. Sometimes life's just falling out from underneath me. Maybe it's worked that way for you. Erwin McManus of the Mosaic Church says, the faith you had yesterday is not faith for you today, and it is not faith for you tomorrow. Because what was faith yesterday is that moment when you stepped out, right? Like Hebrews 1:11 says, faith are things hoped for but unseen. So what was a faithful life yesterday? That's no longer faith because you know that works. A great example of this is how the Hebrews crossed the water twice. The first time, you know the story of the Red Sea, or you've heard this maybe. Moses is leading them out of slavery, and right behind Moses and his people are all these angry Egyptians with their army. And they decided, we've been duped. We want those slaves back to work for us. So they're chasing them down with all of their, one of the most powerful armies in the world, chasing down Moses and the poor Hebrews. And in front of them is this big body of water that they've got to cross. And Moses prays to God, and God parts the Red Sea, and they cross on dry land, and when they get to the other side, they turn around, and the water comes back and engulfs the Egyptians. Well, the second time they have to cross water is the second time they get to the Promised Land. And now Joshua's leading them. Moses has been raising up Joshua as leader. And Joshua is supposed to lead them across the Jordan River to get to the Promised Land, finally. Well, Joshua, being raised up by Moses, has heard the Dead Sea story about 1,000,000 times. Probably he's tired of hearing Moses tell the story yet again around the campfire. Oh, I remember that day when God parted the water. Yes, Moses, we all remember that day God parted the water. So when Joshua sees the Jordan River between them and their destination, Joshua knows how this works, right? Because 2 + 2 is always 4. So Joshua says to God, okay, it's your turn. And God says, no, that's how I did it last time. That's what faith was for you last time. This time, faith is different. And if you read those first couple of chapters of the book of Joshua, it's an amazing story. God says to Joshua, this time, the water will part once you start walking. It's very ritual and formalized. They have to send the priest out with the Ark of the Covenant, and Joshua's out there standing in the water, and the people have to stand so far back. And as soon as those priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant start stepping in the water, that river stops flowing, and the water begins to mound up on one side, and they get to cross over on dry ground. What was faith for you yesterday is not faith for you today, and it's not faith for you tomorrow, because you're growing. You're a living, beautiful, wonderful child of God. We are amazing at keeping our phone software up to date. We are pretty amazing at keeping our pantry with up-to-date food. How amazing are we at keeping our faith current for today? What are we doing to keep our faith up to date for today? For Moses, it was a combination of prayer, study of the scriptures, living it out, taking some risk, stepping forward, listening to God. What is it for us? And as a church, what would it be like for us as a church to be a church where you could walk through that door at any age, chronologically or faith-wise, and feel you were able to take that next step here? What would that look like for us as a church? To be where you could walk in our door, regardless of how old you were as a person, or how old you were as a person curious about Jesus, and take that next step, what would that look like for us? And what's that risk that God's calling us to take so that we can cross the water over to that destination? There are tons of pages left to be written in this story. And God has given each one of you a pen to write some of those pages with.